I'm Angus.
And I'm Andrew.
And we're from Cracka Wines. Today is How to Taste Wine 101.
That's right, Angus. Today we are going to be looking at the way in which you taste wine, specifically results to a Shiraz that we've got in front of us right now.
A cheeky little orange Shiraz. Now, when you're tasting wine, Andy, what are you looking for?
Yeah, I suppose the different things we're looking for when tasting wine, you can sort of break it down. Traditionally, you break it down into three different parts. You're talking about the colour, you're talking about the nose or the way it smells, and the palate or the way it tastes. That is the most traditional way of approaching a wine tasting, and I suppose in Australian wine shows, that is the way that it is still used and still looked at.
Yeah, I mean, you're looking for colour. Like, is it bright? Is it luminous? Does the colour jump out of the glass? It's amazing. Your eyes are really good at seeing what's good in a glass. If the wine looks bad, it's going to taste bad. And then you want it to be complex. You want loads of different fruit flavour, but at the same time you don't want them to be obvious. You want subtlety in those fruit flavour, and then the mouth, everything's just got to be balanced. Everything's got to work together. Not too much fruit, not too much oak, not too much alcohol, and fruit length. Fruit length is one of the keys. So after you've swallowed the wine, how long does it last? In the mouth. So what do you think of this wine, Andrew?
Okay, so we're looking here at what is a cool climate Shiraz, and if we're talking about colour in particular, that whilst this is still quite a bright sort of ruby red, in comparison to, say, some warmer climate South Australian Shiraz, for example, you're not going to have anywhere near that same black, rich colour.
Yep.
That essentially just comes from a slightly different climate. You're not going to get that same sort of condition as to get really super ripe grapes.
That's right, thick skins.
Yeah, there's going to be not the same sort of conditions to end up with that really intense colour that you're going to find in an equivalent South Australian wine. That's not to say that it's any worse, but it's more just slight differences how they be interpreted into colour.
And also concentration. Like if you're making like a low quality wine, high yielding vineyard, not many vines but loads of wine, the wine actually looks dilute. You can see this big watery rim around it, which basically means that they're making too much wine essentially from that particular plot. Aromatically, I mean, this wine, it's youthful, it's got some nice dark fruits, there's a bit of kind of peppery spice, but in the mouth, I mean, what are you looking for when you're tasting? When it's in your mouth, what are you looking for? And how do you taste? What are you doing in your mouth?
Okay, well, obviously the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to give it a nice big swirl. The reason why I'm giving it a nice big swirl is, and everyone obviously wine wankers traditionally, we look like idiots while we're all swirling our glasses like this. But there is a method to the madness. The whole idea of us giving them a nice big swirl here is that we're basically giving the wine a bit of an aeration. And the whole purpose of giving wine a bit of an aeration is that we're trying to allow the release of a bit of volatiles, which just means it's going to release some of the smells and like the aromatics that are coming off it. It's
like turning up the volume on your cask stereo.
That's perfect.
You're getting the same information, you're just getting a bit more of it. And then in the mouth, like what I do is, I put it in my mouth, but I really swish it around my mouth a bit because you've got all these, sensory organs around your mouth, and you're trying to cover the wine, I should say cover those organs with the wine, and also, give it volume in your mouth, suck a bit of air through your mouth. You probably see some people do that, and that basically sucks up the aromatics up in the back of your nose, and then afterwards you just, I kind of brush my tongue around my mouth to see is it rush? I mean, is it kind of heavy and hard? Is it plush? Is it kind of soft and silky? And the tannins, are they astringent? Do they make me kind of weep a bit, or are they kind of just beautiful, soft and silky? And then finally, how long? Is it a fleshy wine that lasts for a long time, or is it short?
Yeah, and I suppose building on that, there's certain things that you're looking for as far as the way that a wine is made. In a wine like this, we're talking about the balance between tannins and acidity. We're also looking at the way that fruit richness sort of balances it all through together. So ultimately, you want something that's going to have the right amount of acidity, the right amount of tannins, and the right amount of fruits. Ultimately, if they all mesh perfectly, then you're going to be looking at something that's really impressive. Of course, the challenges is that in young wines, for example, you're going to find that the tannins can be much more prominent. Conversely, in some older wines, you'll find that a lot of the tannins have dropped out and the flavours are much more subtle and the acidity can be much more marked. And in that sort of way, you have to approach it in slightly different ideals, I suppose, when you're looking at older wines versus younger wines. With a nice, bright, quite fragrant young wine like this, the only challenge you're going to find is that you're probably not seeing exactly what it really could be, because it is so young. And that's why it is really important to be giving that thing a nice big swirl, because you're basically simulating right here what a little bit of aging could be doing for it. And for something that's really young, like a lot of young Australian reds, that's really important, because otherwise you're only getting a tiny little snapshot of exactly what the wine can be.
Yeah, and there's all, but balance is, fruit length, complexity, but balance is just absolute key. It's great if there's tannins there, but there's no fruit to balance it. If it's just all structure and no fruit, then the wine's it'll live, but it's not gonna have much flavour to it. Conversely, if you've got a wine that has loads of fruit but not much tannin, it's gonna be attractive for a short period of time, but then it's gonna fall away and die young.
And just to explain for a second, what exactly is tannins?
Look, tannins are basically, they're polyphenols, basically, astringent molecules that you find in the seeds, the skins as well. And basically what they do is they provide structure to the wine. So that astringency you're feeling when you're tasting wine and you feel a kind of a hardness, that is the tannins. So those tannins, though, they also help a wine to age. They slow the aging process as well as give it the structure to age. And they're, it's interesting, they come from the skins. So grapes such as, Shiraz and Cabernet, thick skins, loads of tannins. Pinot Noir, thin skin, much less tannin. So often when they're making Pinot, they actually get the stalks from the grapes, throw it in the ferment to get some of those tannins out. They're slightly different tannins, but they are somewhat similar, and they can provide structure. And some of the great Pinot producers of the world use that, essentially. But as Andrew said, acid's really important. Is the wine, for a wine to live, it needs some freshness and life, and sometimes you get these young, heavy wines, the acid is not there because they've been overripe, and it's kind of nice. But I like wines with good acidity, with freshness, that, after you swallow them, you feel the fruit length, but there's this kind of, moistness to your mouth, basically, a bit of salivation saying, give me another glass.
Yeah, definitely. And the challenge, of course, we're talking here about red wines. Conversely, white wines have no tannins, because the way that, or very little tannins, the whole idea about white wines is to make sure that you get the juice off as quickly as possible and have the wine in contact with the skin less so. The result is that you don't get the same sort of tannins at all. So instead, acidity becomes much more important in white wines, and that balance between fruit and acidity is much more important than you would actually find in a red wine, for example. The difference, I suppose, is that acidity, just like tannins, can also act as a preservative the same way too, which you'll find in something like Hunter Valley Semillon, where it has quite a lot of acidity, which also tends to make it a much more ageable prospect, if anything.
Yeah.
The other thing is, when we're talking about aging of wines, is that there's only one component that will essentially never change, and that is the acidity. So if they haven't got the acidity right to start with, then the acidity will actually never be right. And that's just the one constant you'll always find with wine tasting, is that acidity is actually something that is really very important. And when a winemaker can actually make sure you get it right, then you can have something that's going to live for a long time, as well as tasting balance from the start.
There's one complexity with acidity, though, is, warm climates, white wines, you still need acidity. So the option is, do they pick early, like they do in South Australia for Riesling and Hunter Valley Semillon, or do you get the tin of acidity out, get the tin of tartaric out, and put it in the wine? And unfortunately, the added acidity, while it gives freshness, it doesn't necessarily help the wines age as much as natural acidity. It gives it this kind of fizzy, sherbety kind of taste, which is nice and adds freshness, but it doesn't give these beautiful clean lines you get from fresh acid, from Tassie Riesling or Mornington Chardonnay, or even Chardonnay from New Zealand or France.
That's exactly right. And natural acidity is something that ultimately you're always looking for, and you'll find that the very best vineyards actually will produce grapes that have more natural acidity. That's basically just because the vines are in balance and they're producing better quality grapes. So that's almost like the ultimate, is to be able to grow grapes that have fantastic natural acidity. And in the very best years, you'll find that they have excellent levels of natural acidity as well as lots of fruit. And that's almost like the holy grail, where you get the acidity sort of matching right up with the sugars, and you're just like, wow, this is exactly what we want our grapes to be doing. The challenge, of course, is that in drought years, for example, or really hot years, like we've seen a couple in South Australia over the last couple of years, where they've had just these terrible heat waves, and as a result, the acidity has dropped far too quickly, and they've ended up having to add a lot of acid to try and egg everything out. And the challenge, of course, is that those acids aren't natural, and they actually tend to really stick out in a wine. And so you'll find that if they can manage to end up in a situation where they've got great natural acidity, the wines will always be much more balanced. which ultimately is the reason why cool climates can be preferred in many ways for crafting certain styles of wines.
That's right. So, tasting wine, looking for complexity, fruit length, freshness, acidity, good tannins, but ideally balance.
Balance.
Everything comes together. The great wines, nothing stands out. You just taste it and go, wow, that's brilliant. Nothing stands out. It's just a beautiful wine.
That's right. And I mean, there's one other thing that we haven't talked about so far, and that's the mysterious extra sense, which is umami, which is the whole idea of mouthfeel, which it's something that is sort of talked about with certain wine styles, and it's something that we all like to sort of try and find in a wine. But it's the whole idea of umami is just finding that little bit of extra textural mouthfeel, that little bit of extra complexity that you'll find in certain wine styles that really just makes them stand right out as being something really interesting. I mean, there's certain wines where you're just like, wow, this is just so interesting and so different that really makes certain things just really stick out. You'll find, for example, you find some old Italian whites, for example, where they've been aged for a very long time in oak, and they produce these really bizarre, strange wines that just have all these really complex flavours, and you're just like, wow, this is just this most unusual and interesting sort of wine. And again, that's just one of the joys of wine, that you end up with something that is so different than anything else.
That's right. Well, wine tasting 101, care of Cracka.